Hello and welcome back to another map making video. This one is going to be actually a map for my work in progress book. I love making maps, so I figured I'd make my own, and I'm just going to be painting this one in. I'm going to step you through how I paint and also a little bit about Asteria. So to begin this project, I did do the line art for this, and this was using the Sakura Pigma Micron pens, and the reason why I use that is because they don't wash away when you use watercolors over the top. I often get that question, what pens am I using? That's what I use, but there are a bit different options as well. I think Copic also has a line of good fine liners that do the exact same thing, so whatever you can find, that'll work. So the first thing I always do is paint the sea or any water that I have. And the reason why I like to do that and where I started is usually the sea is on the exterior of the painting. So in this one, it's actually just at the bottom and sort of in the north, but it's a good starting spot. You can kind of mess up the sea and it doesn't really matter. It's basically putting some blue down, but it's a good place to get started if you're not really sure what you want to be painting exactly and the colors and everything. So that's where I start. Once I've painted in the sea, I then start putting my base layer of just colors for the land. Now I use the Kuretake watercolors, like a set of them, but honestly it doesn't really matter what set, as long as you've got some lovely yellows, oranges, and plenty of greens to work with. You can make a really good watercolor map. I use these ones because those are the ones I bought and I haven't finished them, so I'm just going to keep using them until I'm out. One thing I focus on when I am painting maps like this is trying to give the impression of the climate and the biome that that area has. So for example, in the south here, there's a lot more yellows, plenty of green still, especially around the rivers, but the south is a bit drier than up north. And then finally, really far up north, I used like a bluish green rather than a yellowish green. So that gives the impression of it being really cold. Now the main sea on this map is called the Golden Sea, and it's named that because it's actually a very calm sea. It's basically like there's like three seas in between. It doesn't get that much wind, and so it just has a lot of little tiny ripples, and those ripples often sort of shine with sunlight, and so it's given a very poetic name of the Golden Sea because the top of the sea ripples golden like. There's no actual gold, so don't go treasure hunting. So where is Asteria exactly on this map? So Asteria is like slap bang in the middle for obvious reasons. That's the setting, and then all the countries around it are like important countries that do kind of get involved and mentioned throughout the book, and therefore I wanted to include them on this map. Asteria is a pretty expansionist sort of nation, so it originally started in this like little valley between the mountains and the sea that I was just showing you earlier, and it has expanded up north into the mountains. So there are three main kingdoms up in the mountains. There's Jessier to the west, alongside it is Vesgard, and then finally there's Yivior before the mountain range goes way up north, and that's not really relevant for Asteria. Vesgard and Yivior are currently under the dominion of Asteria. Yivior is like a little bit less rebellious about that fact, but Vesgard, they're not very happy. Now, because of this massive mountain range up in the north, there are huge river systems that filter down to the sea below, and the main river system right slap bang in the middle is where a lot of Asturian stuff goes on. But there's a second river system that marks the border between Asteria and its current rival Moravia, and that's the border there on that river for now at least. Now, off the map to the west, beyond where Moravia is another sea. So that's like the actual main ocean. And so a lot of weather fronts come through there and they roll over Moravia into Asteria and eventually get out west at that sort of large lake, sort of inland sea situation. And that's the border of Asteria right now. It's pretty dry out there. If you go any further than that, it's basically just like prairie. It's very flat, open grassland. So I tried to express that using a lot of like bright greens and yellows. So like it's very lush, and then it goes into a sort of more like, I guess, boggy existence. You can see the swamps, and then finally it moves off into this more rugged reddish tones for the grasslands and prairies and hills over in the east. Once I painted the first layer of colors, I went in, and I always go in with a second layer or more just to give some more vibrance to certain areas. So one thing I really like to do is go over the seas and just along the coast, darken that up, and then put a gradient from the dark coast to the center of the sea. I just find that makes it look more dynamic, and then it leads the eye towards the coastline and the land, which is what I want people to be focusing on. So I usually achieve this gradient by putting like basically a line of really intense color, whether that be watercolor or gouache. I'm pretty sure in this example I used gouache, and basically then go along the edge of that with some water. And that usually lets the color flow out. Sometimes it can take a little bit of work layering in a bit more pigment. I haven't like put enough of the actual color in, and the water dilutes it too much, but trial and error, eventually we get there. Now back to a little bit of world building. This sea is actually really important for the history of Astoria. So off the map, just to the south and attached to the sea, is a place called Rese, and that was like the capital of the Ringardian Empire. And they expanded first into Cerro, which is the nation to the east, southeast of Asteria. It's got that little peninsula shape coming out into the sea. And they got them first, and then they rolled on into Asteria. And after the Ringardian Empire sort of semi-collapsed, Asteria and Cerro, united as a country, continued on, basically claiming they were still Ringard, even though, of course, they don't have Rese as their capital. Think of it a bit like the Byzantine Empire, continuing on even after, like, the Roman Empire officially is, like, it's no longer in Rome, but they're still going. Eventually, the two countries decided they actually wanted nothing to do with each other, and they split kind of in half, but mostly there's a narrow section of land between the coast and the mountains in one section, and that is the border. That's where Cerro and Astoria split, and Astoria sort of officially went back to their old ways, with some modifications for the ruling family who've held power for the last like 300 years because of those modifications, when traditionally power moved between different noble families before the conquest, but that's not important. No one needs to talk about that. And then Cerro continues to like say that they're actually Ringard, and the Ringardians, sorry, not the Ringardians, the Asturians are like officially don't acknowledge them as the Ringardians. They're like, you're from Cerro. And the reason why they call them from Cerro rather than like Serrans officially is the capital city is called Cerro. So they're like, yes, the king from Cerro rather than like the king of Ringard, which is his official title. They don't really acknowledge that. They're like, oh, you're not really Ringard though, are you? And now I've talked a little bit about that, let's get back into how I actually painted this painting. So once I've gone and done my second layer for the sea, I then like to go in and start doing the rivers. So this usually is very delicate process, often because I don't think ahead and I make the rivers really small, and then I have to go through and try and paint them all. But the great thing about watercolor is you just need to embrace that it's going to overflow, it's going to leave your lines. it's not going to be perfect, and that actually makes it more interesting and dynamic in the end. So you can try, but yeah, don't worry if it goes over the lines. Now, sometimes with the water as well, I actually find that I might want to use some gouache instead of watercolor. And gouache is more pigmented, so you see less of what's beneath. So that's is really good when you're trying to cover up a lot of greens, like this example. Now, after I've done that, I start with the mountains and the hills. You can also do the forest, but generally this is the layers that I go in. So mountains and hills, despite not actually being brown, I almost always paint brown. And the reason why is because it tends to like color-wise match everything else on my paintings. Making them gray or blue just makes them look weird. I don't know why, because like from a distance, mountains are generally blue or like gray fog, or there'll be some like white on the top of them. Anything that's not brown, but that's the color I tend to use because it works. Now there is a trick with putting the mountain colors in. So usually I'll do a section, I'll put some dark pigmented like on the mountain itself. And then much like with the water, I put just drops of water at the bottom so that it has the gradient into the green that I've already put down. And so it doesn't have like the harsh line at the bottom. I really hate that in my watercolor maps. And so I do my best to avoid the harsh cutoffs that tend to happen if you just put the paint down and you don't do anything at the bottom or the edges. So once I've put my watercolor down, my gouache down, I then go in with some alcohol markers, and usually these are for the details or to just add a little pop of color. In this case, I'm using the Ohuhu set because they're a lot cheaper than the Copics and they work just as well. So I put in the color for all of these little trees that I drew. Sometimes I like doing like little individual trees on my map, and sometimes I do like a big blob of tree like stuff. In this case, I did the little trees because I wanted to have a lot of room to put in labels in later. Another option I like to do is to darken the mountains themselves. So I talked about the gradient before, but like the tops of the mountains, I like to darken with the alcohol markers as well in some browns. So one side of the mountain is a little bit darker than the other side of the mountain. It just makes them pop a little bit more. I also just do the tops of the hills and all that jazz. So those like main sections pop out from the general malaise of greens and yellows and all of that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the magic in this fantasy world. So there are these items of magical power, and so they're called keys among the Asterians. Not the standard term everywhere else, but the Asterians call them keys because they sort of effectively unlock the magic. So you like open a door into the realm of magic that is usually unseen. And that's how they interpret the magic. So they call them keys. And these basically, each individual key has a different ability. So the title of the book is The Seeker's Key for good reason. So the main character, he ends up with a key, and that key is the Seeker's Key. And so that power basically gives him a little bit of insight. It's magical guidance. It tells you the best way to get somewhere. It's basically like magical GPS. So if the usual route has some danger or more traffic than usual, it's like, hey, it's a bit faster to go this way. As long as that's the request you're making to the seeker. It's a little bit more advanced at times, so it can be very helpful if you know how to use it. So that's the map of Asteria and beyond, and a little bit about what that map actually means. So yeah, thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you in the next one.